All right, let's talk about Blur. For 3 decades, this was a band defined by a constant, creative war, a war with itself. And that's what we're breaking down today.
You know, the entire chaotic history of Blur really comes down to this one central conflict. On one side, you've got the pull of being these massive mainstream pop stars, and on the other, the push to be experimental vanguard artists. This tension, this was the engine that drove everything. Every hit, every meltdown, every single reinvention.
So, here's how we're going to track that journey. We'll start with that initial pop star versus artist phase, see how they invented Cool Britannia, then watch them tear it all down. We'll look at the years they were a band apart, their surprise reunion, and finally ask, did they actually win the long game?
All right, first up, pop stars versus artists. Right from the very beginning, Blur really didn't know who they wanted to be. You could just feel this tug of war between their chaotic art school roots and, well, the irresistible lure of the pop charts. So, they start out as this art school band called Seymour, and they're just pure chaotic energy. But then they get signed, change their name to Blur, and bam! They score this massive top 10 hit with There's No Other Way. How? By just perfectly nailing that popular baggy, Manchester sound everyone was into at the time. Just like that, they were pop stars. But yeah, that early success? It turned out to be a total trap. The record label sends them to America to try and make some money, right smack in the middle of the grunge explosion. And you can guess what happened. American audiences who were completely obsessed with Nirvana just didn't care. The tour was an absolute catastrophe. They ended up in huge debt, literally fighting each other, and came so close to being dropped and just ending the band right there.
Okay, but here's the crazy thing. That failure, that near-death experience in America, it became the catalyst for one of the biggest cultural shifts in modern British music. Seriously, out of the ashes of that disaster, Blur was about to build an empire.
So how did they do it? Well, it all starts with the frontman, Damon Albarn. He reacts to this whole American nightmare by just doubling down on everything English. He's deeply homesick, and he's starting to really resent this American cultural dominance. So what does he do? He starts obsessively listening to bands like the Kinks and writes a whole new batch of songs that are basically a manifesto for a new British identity, celebrating all the little quirks of life in England.
They first laid out this new vision on an album called Modern Life is Rubbish, which kind of set the stage. But then came Parklife. And Parklife, that was the revolution. It was an absolute phenomenon. It just perfectly captured this national mood of optimism and pride, and it made Blur the undisputed, definitive sound of Cool Britannia.
And the scale of this success was just immense. Look at this. 4 Brit Awards in one night. The whole country was buzzing with this new Labour optimism under Tony Blair. And Blur's music basically became the unofficial soundtrack for all of it. They weren't just a band anymore. They were at the absolute center of British culture. But then, right at the absolute peak of their fame, they get tangled up in a rivalry that would define them forever. And then, almost immediately after, they started to tear the whole thing down. And that rivalry, of course, was with Oasis. The media just ran with it, framing it as this huge cultural and class war. You had Blur, the middle-class art school kids from the South, and then you had Oasis, the working-class, authentic rockers from the North. It became way bigger than just the music. It was about the North-South divide. It was about class. It was about who was real. And it all came to a head in this epic chart battle. A battle that Blur, by the way, deliberately engineered by moving their singles release date to go head-to-head with Oasis. And as you can see, it worked. They won. Country House sold more than Roll With It, and Blur got their first ever #1 single. But here's the twist. The guitarist, Graham Coxon, his reaction to this massive victory? Hollow and pointless. He felt the whole thing was just an empty publicity stunt. And that moment, that was really the beginning of the end for their pop star phase. The band started to resent the very thing they had worked so hard to build. So what do you do when you win the pop game? Well, if you're Blur, you decide to systematically destroy everything you just built. They actively turned against the whole Britpop monster that they themselves had helped create. So that polished Britpop sound? Gone. Totally rejected. Instead, thanks to Graham's love for American indie bands like Pavement, their music became raw, it became noisy, it became really experimental. And lyrically, Damon Albarn completely abandoned those character sketches of English life and started writing these incredibly personal, vulnerable songs about the painful end of his relationship with Justine Frischmann from Elastica.
This deconstruction got super technical on their 1999 album 13. Working with the producer William Orbit, they totally changed how they made music. They'd have these long, improvised jam sessions and then use cutting-edge tools like Pro Tools and Logic to literally chop the recordings up into little pieces and then stitch them back together into these chaotic, new electronic soundscapes.
Well, all these internal and creative tensions, they finally just boiled over. It happened during these really difficult recording sessions in Morocco for the next album. Graham Coxon was struggling personally. He felt totally alienated by the band's new direction, and he was pretty much asked to leave. He officially quit in 2002, and for all intents and purposes, that was the end of Blur.
So, with Blur on Ice, what happened next is, well, you couldn't make it up. The members went off and led these wildly different lives. Damon Albarn becomes a global superstar all over again with his virtual band Gorillaz. Alex James moves to a 200-acre farm and becomes an award-winning cheesemaker. And Dave Rowntree, he becomes a qualified solicitor and a local Labour Party councillor. I mean, wow.
So for years, a reunion just seemed completely impossible. No way. The split was way too bitter. But then, a quiet, very personal moment between two old friends changed absolutely everything.
Yeah, after more than 5 years of not speaking, Damon Albarn and Graham Coxon quietly patched things up. And for Damon, he said getting his childhood friend back was actually more important than getting the band back. But that reconciliation is what led to a full reunion tour, and it all culminated in this legendary, absolutely career-defining headline show at Glastonbury. And you'd think that would be the end of the story, but their next album happened completely by accident. Get this, a music festival they were supposed to play in Japan gets canceled. The band is suddenly stranded in Hong Kong for 5 days with nothing to do. So what do? They book a little studio and just jam. Years go by, Graham Coxon finds the tapes, starts building them into songs, shows them to Damon, and boom, you get a surprise comeback album in 2015. Which brings us to today, and to the final, really complex chapter of their story. A chapter where that old rivalry with Oasis comes roaring back in a way nobody expected.
For a long time, this quote from bassist Alex James just seemed to perfectly sum it all up, right? Blur won the battle of the singles, Oasis won the album sales war. But Blur, with their constant reinvention and critical acclaim, they won the whole campaign. They won the long game for a more interesting, adventurous legacy. It made perfect sense.
But then, there was a final twist. It's 2024. Blur plays Coachella to a young American crowd that just seems completely uninterested. It's a disaster. At the same time, Oasis announces their reunion tour and sells out stadiums worldwide instantly. And watching all this, Damon Albarn himself finally just conceded defeat. His words, Oasis won everything.
So, where does that leave us? Well, Blur's whole story really forces you to ask this question. What is the true measure of success? What really defines a band's greatness? Is it the commercial dominance, selling all the records, filling the stadiums? Or is it the artistic evolution, having the courage to constantly tear everything down just to see what you can build next?